All right, Alexander, let's do an update on the summit that is going to be taking place in Alaska between US President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. What are your thoughts on the summit that is going to be taking place this Friday? A lot of anger and panic and pushback from the European Union, from the UK, from Ukraine, and also from the collective West mainstream media. And I would say a lot of mixed messages coming out of the Trump White House as well. A lot of talk on territory. Actually, the entire focus is on territory, and I think that's a mistake actually, because there's a lot of issues that need to be discussed. But anyway, what are your thoughts as we head into the week of the big meeting?
It is just to come back to what you said. I mean, just limiting it to territory is a massive mistake. It completely misjudges the origins of the war, which, of course, it's taboo to talk about in the West, and they probably don't even talk about it very much with each other. But the reason for the war was NATO expansion and the fact that Ukraine was drifting into it wasn't drifting. It had become heavily involved in a military alliance with the West. And that is what caused the war. That was what caused the original Maidan revolution of 2013, 2014, which, to be clear, was an extremely violent color revolution backed by the United States. It was what provoked the uprisings in Crimea and then in Donbass. It was what led to the war. It was what caused the Russian intervention. And if you follow closely the diplomacy in the weeks leading up to the start of the conflict itself between, April 2021 and February 2022, you could see again NATO expansion was absolutely the center stage of the whole thing. And the fact that in the West, there's been this constant, continuous denial of this truth doesn't promise very well, I have to say, for the summit meeting on Friday. I mean, I think if Donald Trump thinks that he's simply going to come along and tell the Russians, look, I don't want Ukraine to join NATO, and that's not what's going to happen when I'm president. I think what he's going to discover is that that's not anywhere near enough for the Russians. I just want to say that because I think that's an important point that you've just made. And it's one that in all of the talk about territory, about territorial swaps, about all of that, this is getting massively overlooked. Now, in all other respects, everything that you said is absolutely true. There is panic, there is anger. I think there's bewilderment as well, because remember, Zelensky, the Europeans, they were all looking forward to the announcement on the 8th of August of massive sanctions and tariffs against Russia. They were looking forward to attacks on Russia's shadow fleet and all of that. And again, Trump takes us almost to that point, and then he retreats. He really knows, I think, the implications of what it is that the Europeans and the neocons and people like that in the United States want him to do. He understands perhaps better than they do what the effect of this is going to be on the US and on the Western economies, and of course on his own political position. And he doesn't want to go there. But we had all that messaging from Trump, from the White House, from all of those people telling us that definitely tariffs were coming, sanctions were coming. We were seeing the United States sort of reverse its position on military supplies to Ukraine. They'd stop supplying them, and then they resumed supplying them, and then there was this arrangement that the Europeans would buy them and all of that. So the Europeans, the Ukrainians, a week ago were very confident about their position. And then suddenly they learn that Witkoff has gone to Moscow, and the summit meeting with Putin is coming. The deadline on the 8th of August comes and goes. The sanctions aren't there. The tariffs aren't there. The United States is talking to Moscow again, and horror upon horror. Trump is meeting Putin. He's meeting Putin in the United States, in Alaska, and the Americans and the Russians are in direct negotiations. So you could see the panic, you could see the anger. It's not difficult to understand the reasons for it. But what then, of course, happens, and it is completely predictable, is there is this enormous reaction. And the whole weekend is a repeat of this tiresome and ultimately totally destructive process whereby before any negotiation with the other side in this case being the Russians, but it might be the Iranians, or it might be the Chinese, or it might be someone else, the West starts to negotiate with itself. And we've seen a massive negotiation between the West, the various parts of the West take place in advance of the summit. And it's explained that the West needs to come to a common position. Nobody really ever explains why the West needs to come to a common position, but it's taken as read that that's what they need to do. And of course, what also then inevitably happens is that common position ultimately reverts to being the previous established consensus position, because agreeing to it is, the easiest thing to do. We revert, if you like, to the common denominator. So we have a statement from the Europeans: no territory swaps, no surrenders of territory, a freeze of the conflict, an unconditional ceasefire along the existing front lines. The negotiations can then begin, but they can go on indefinitely. Security guarantees for Ukraine, which could include NATO membership. And that is, of course, the European position all along. It's the neocon position in the United States. And it's the proposal the Russians have already rejected. And, of course, the administration itself, which is far from united about this. There's the president himself, who sort of seems to have some understanding that he's being maneuvered into a very dangerous position for himself and for the West. Sometimes has these impulses to try to move outside this common denominator position. There are others, like his vice president, who clearly have a better understanding of this altogether. And he made some very interesting comments yesterday, which need to be deciphered and unpacked very, very carefully. You have Lindsey Graham, who also gave a very interesting interview yesterday, in which he swore his absolute loyalty and support to the president and basically undermined the whole process, as we can also discuss. And of course, we have the hardliners within the administration who are now busy trying to unpack the summit, to unravel it, to get Zelensky there in Alaska, after all, to organize the tripartite meeting, to do all of the things that we were told just a few days ago weren't going to happen. So you could see the process play out and how it plays out. And again, until and unless the president puts his foot down and says to all of these people, the Europeans, his hardliners within his own administration, the people in Congress, look, I am the president of the United States. This is what I judge to be in the national interest of the United States. I am going to make this deal with Russia. If the Ukrainians don't like it, they can lump it. If the Europeans don't like it, they can lump it. They can go wherever they want. They can carry on the war by themselves, as far as I'm concerned. But until and unless the president does that, we are going to have this situation play out again and again and again. And that's what I think we saw over the weekend.
Well, that's what Vance said, pretty much.
Yeah.
He pretty much said, "Look, we're done funding Project Ukraine.
Yeah.
If the Europeans want to buy weapons from us and deal with Project Ukraine, that's fine. But we're done funding Project Ukraine." So that's what he told Fox News, Maria Bartiromo. But the issue that that the White House has, that Trump has, is that he's not really negotiating with the Europeans at all. He's negotiating with the neocons. The neocons put the Europeans forward, and the Europeans they whine and they cry and they panic. But it's really the neocons that are negotiating with the Trump White House.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't even use the word negotiating. They're dictating to Trump. And it's the neocons that are telling the president of the United States no. Because the counter proposal that they presented to Vance when he was at Lammy's house or wherever he was over the weekend. I don't know how he lasted a whole weekend with Lammy, but anyway, that's another video for another time. Yeah. But that counter proposal is not really a counter proposal. It talks about reciprocal land exchanges and stuff. It was just nonsense. It was just basically the Europeans with the neocons in back of them saying, no, the war is going to continue. Yes. The war will continue. We don't care what Witkoff and Putin talked about or what they discussed. So, I mean, that's the essence of, I believe, the problem that the United States has and that the Trump White House has, that Trump maneuvered himself into, is the fact that he cannot stand up to the neocons. Many people will argue he cannot stand up to the neocons because there's a part of him which wants approval from the neocons. There's a part of him that is a neocon-ish. There's a part of his administration, a very close part, like Rubio and these people who are neocons. So, until he can stand up to the neocons, the Europeans, who cares about the vassals? What the vassals say, they're vassals. It doesn't matter what they say. Zelensky's a puppet. Doesn't matter what he says. It's the neocons. And I'm not only talking about Congress. I'm not only talking about the Senate or Lindsey Graham. You're talking about think tanks. You're talking about NGOs. You're talking about donors. They're everywhere in D.C. And they're telling Trump via the Europeans, via Zelensky, no way are you going to stop this war. That's what they're telling Trump. The fact that Vance, when he was speaking to Maria Bartiromo, once again tried to make it as if the United States is a mediator, and they're going to speak with Russia first, and then they're going to try to get a trilateral meeting with Ukraine. That's fiction, but Russia goes along with it. That's why there's so many people upset with the fact that, why is Russia talking to the United States when it's the United States that's at war with Russia via Ukraine? I think that's something that needs to be unpacked. But Russia is going along with the fiction of the U.S. as mediators, even though they are getting a bilateral meeting, which to me, if you cut through all the BS, indicates that this is a meeting between the two countries at war. It's the meeting between Russia and the United States. Those are the countries at war. Everyone else can describe it however they want, peace through strength, and Trump should get a Nobel Peace Prize and the U.S. is mediating. It's all spin. What the Russians have accomplished is they managed to get a bilateral meeting between the two countries that are fighting, which is the United States of America and Russia. Anyway, your thoughts on what I said, and you also talked about unpacking what Vance said. I mentioned a little bit about his interview.
You provided a masterly summary, if I can say, because you've anticipated many of the points I wanted to make. And by the way, I completely agree. Can I just deal with your point about the Russians and the Americans? The reason the Russians are talking to the Americans is because this is a war between America and Russia. It's a proxy war, so it's described. I don't really think that is an adequate or proper term, because
I think in the past you said it's more than a proxy war, and you explained why it's more than a coalition
war. It is a coalition war by the collective West, led by the United States against Russia. But you're absolutely right. It is the Americans who have been orchestrating this war. They've done it all along. We know they were even commanding the Ukrainian army and drawing up its plans, and that the real operational headquarters, which, by the way, I suspect is still the case, the real operation headquarters is not in Kiev, it's in Wiesbaden, and it's headed by American generals. So, I mean, of course, this is a war between Russia and the United States. And it's precisely because the United States is now losing that war that the Americans have finally come round to the need to talk to the Russians. And this is true not just now, but it's been true ever since Trump became president. He's at least recognized that. And it is because the Russians are in a war with the United States that they need to talk with the Americans. The Russians have, if nothing else happens, if Putin comes, meets Trump in Alaska, they talk about all of these various plans and schemes and ideas, and they don't agree about anything, but they just meet and talk about those things. From a Russian point of view, that is already a big step forward, because it is the United States finally talking to Russia directly about this war, which the United States has been engaged in against Russia and which Russia is winning. From a Russian point of view, this summit in Alaska makes total sense if it is understood in that way, because if it is going to be ended through a negotiation, it has to be a negotiation between the principal parties, who are not Russia and Ukraine, they are Russia and the United States. So that's the first thing to say. Now, about the neocons and the Europeans, to confirm what you said about the Europeans simply doing what the neocons want them to do. Well, you mentioned Lindsey Graham, and I watched this interview that he gave yesterday. And it was fascinating because he admitted that he was talking to the Europeans all the time. He'd been talking to the Ukrainians. He'd been talking to all of the European leaders. He spoke about how he was on the phone to them. Upon what basis does a US senator talk to the leaders and officials of all of these countries? I mean, he's a senator. He is encroaching on the president's prerogatives. Now, there was a time when I used to listen to Lindsey Graham talking in this way about how all of these conversations he had and about how pleased they all were, with J.D. Vance, and, J.D. Vance got the stamp of approval, and how, well Trump is conducting this. It sounded like the schoolmaster giving out scorecards to Vance and Trump and to the Europeans. But it was obvious who was really in control. It was Lindsey Graham talking to the Europeans and telling the Europeans and the Ukrainians what kind of position they should follow. And yes, he did float the possibility of territorial swaps, but of course nobody takes that seriously. The whole idea is ridiculous and we can forget it. So it was fascinating to see it in action. He does it in a kind of clever way because he pretends that he is supportive of Trump and of this process, but in reality, he's dictating the outcome. I mean, that was clearly what he was doing, and that's go to the interview. You can easily find it. It's on YouTube as well, I believe, and you can watch it, and it's all there. So no doubt about it, none at all. Now, let's go now to Vance, who's the most interesting person, because he, of course, has to maneuver very carefully. He's the vice president of the United States. He needs to be loyal to the president of the United States, who's Donald Trump. And I think that is absolutely the correct thing for him to be. I think people, again, misunderstand what a vice president's job is. If the vice president undermines the president, well, I mean, he can't. It is a crisis within the US government, and that's not what Vance is trying to do. But you could see that Vance is, at least, or so it seemed to me, trying to steer this whole discussion back towards more rational ends. So he said, look, we are sick and tired of this war in the United States. We're not going to provide any more money to this war. If the Europeans want to buy weapons from us, they're free to do so. We've never said no. And that, by the way, is an important point people tend to overlook. The Europeans have always had the option of buying weapons from the United States. In fact, the United States always sells them most of the weapons they use. About supplying weapons to Ukraine, well, the United States would have to agree to that because they are American weapons. But there's never been any real doubt that the United States would agree. So that's not really a concession from the American side. So Vance says this, and he says the president is not guaranteeing the success of this process, but he thinks he has to make an effort, and he has to go along, and he has to meet with Putin. But ultimately, if it doesn't succeed, well, there we are. And I noticed that Vance also said, he was asked, he's a very clever man. He was asked about sanctions, tariffs, and all of the rest. He said, "Okay, I'm not excluding it, not at all. We may very well do that, but there are a lot of other things in play in our dealings with these various countries, which we need to look into as well, and we can't just go straightforwardly and do it." So again, a very carefully modulated response from Vance, but you can see, I mean, it was clear to me that he is the big skeptic. I mean, this is my own view, that he is the big skeptic in this administration about the whole process. He made that fairly clear when he was still a United States senator, and nothing that he said yesterday made me think that his views have in any way changed.
No, I think it's clear that you have the Vance Witkoff wing of things, and then you have the Kellogg, Lindsey Graham neocon side of things.
Yes.
And there's no doubt that the neocon side is much bigger, much more entrenched, much more powerful, has much more influence than Vance, Witkoff, and whatever other people are in the Trump administration that do want to see some sort of end to the conflict, or at least want to see the United States out of the Ukraine game, right? I think that's a small group of people, while the neocon side is massive.
Yes,
it's just a massive group of people with a tremendous amount of money and influence.
I'm going to quickly say one thing about that. You're absolutely right. Within the American political establishment,
that's what I'm talking about.
The people who want to end the war are a very, very small group of people. I mean, the American establishment overall they are completely hostile to what Trump, what the administration, what these people are trying to do. They want the war to continue. They still harbor plans to defeat Russia. No question about this. Within American society overall, the balance changes. And here, by the way, I just want to make one important point. I think one of the great problems is that the president, Donald Trump, has underestimated the strength of his original political position. If he'd come in January and February and March and April and said, look, this has gone far too far. This doesn't make any kind of sense. I am going to end US involvement in this war now. That was what I'm elected to do. The majority of the American people support me in this. I think he could have done it. I think perhaps he still can do it. But he doesn't believe that himself. He's very awed and intimidated by all of these people, the American establishment altogether. And what he is doing by being frightened of them and going along with them is that, of course, he's undermining the strength of his own position. He's actually weakening it over time, because the more concessions you make to this group, the stronger they become, the weaker you are. And just to go back to Trump, and we don't really need to discuss this in detail, does he have a neocon side? Absolutely. Does he share many of their preconceptions? Of course he does. No question about this too. He himself, at some level, is conflicted. But I do believe that he also has another side which draws him more towards the Vance-Witkoff view of things. Because as a businessman, he could see that this is a losing proposition. It doesn't make sense. It's the sunk costs fallacy taken to its ultimate point. And that's, I think, where the divisions within Trump are.
Oh, there's a real politics side to Trump. I absolutely agree with you on that. It's the problem is that he always sides with the neocon part of things. At least that's what we've seen over the past 6 months. And look at where it's brought him.
Exactly.
It's gotten him nothing, and here he is with one more chance to take Putin's June 2024 off ramp.
Yes.
But what he needs to do is I agree with you. He needs to take it. He needs to take this off ramp. Forget about the Europeans. Forget about Zelensky. Finally, stand up to the neocons, and get support from the American people. You know, he posts all kinds of dumb, ridiculous nonsense on Truth Social all the time. Maybe he should post something on Truth where he tells the American people exactly what you said. I'm out of the Ukraine war. I'm out of the Ukraine business. It was a bad idea. We should have never started. And he needs to say that. Yeah. We, as the United States, should have never started it. Yeah. We should have never provoked it.
Yeah.
And we need to get out of this.
Yes.
And that's what I'm doing.
Exactly.
And I need your support. And he should say it. I need your support.
Yes. That's
what he should say. Anyway, the issue of territory, so we can begin to wrap up this video. Everyone is talking about territory. The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNN, they're writing all kinds of articles, citing anonymous officials familiar with the details anyway about the plans to swap territory, the plans to freeze the conflict in place, Putin's plans to capture all the oblasts and more. Everyone has their ideas and their thoughts about what's going to be the agreement on territory. I personally believe that it's going to be Istanbul plus.
Yeah,
I don't think Putin is going to be able to retreat from that position, even if he may want to make a deal with the United States. It's in the Russian constitution. I think Putin's presidency would be in serious jeopardy if he agreed to some sort of a freeze on the current contact line or some sort of a swap with Donetsk and Lugansk and swap Zaporozhye or so. I mean, there's all kinds of ideas and speculation going around. I can't see anything else but Istanbul plus June 2024. But there's a lot more on the table that needs to be discussed. There's no NATO. There's no EU. I think it would be a big mistake to agree to Ukraine going into the EU, because the EU and NATO is pretty much the same thing.
Yes.
There's no more weapons to Ukraine. There's elections. Perhaps Putin and Trump discussed dissolving the SBU and the intel agencies and the CIA presence and the NGOs and all of these things in Ukraine. Dissolving this Germany headquarters, dissolving the weapons flow from ending the weapons flow from Poland and from Romania and from Greece. All these things need to be discussed, and while the focus is on territory, because that's what they're fighting over right now. I mean, it's a war of attrition, but everyone is always concerned about the territory and who's gaining what. There's another way that you can win the conflict and the war. And that's dealing with the diplomacy, with the presence of the intel agencies and the U.S. Intel agencies in Ukraine, and the U.S. influence in NGOs, and the puppet leadership in Kiev, and all of these things can be rooted out of Project Ukraine, and that could take Russia one step closer, actually very close, to accomplishing the SMO goals, which were demilitarization and denazification.
Indeed. Putin made a very interesting point a couple of days ago at the Valan monastery where he was, and he was asked about this, and he said, look, our position is the same. This is just about, this is last week. Our position is the same as what we set out at the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June, 2024. We're not retreating from that. But these are not just conditions. They are goals. He actually used exactly the word that you have used now. And of course, if you go back to the speech he made to the foreign ministry on the 14th of June, 2024, which I did. I was reading it with great interest over the weekend, by the way. You will find every single point that you've just made there. It's all clearly and fully set out. Some things maybe less so. I mean, the Wiesbaden headquarters, for example. I'm sure the Russians knew about it then, but he went into enormous detail about the history of the conflict, the role of the United States in it, the role of NATO in it, the part the Europeans are playing. He had scathing things to say about the Europeans, who, again, he referred to as vassals in exactly the way that you have done. And he set it all out. And he said, these are the objectives that we have and which we must achieve. He said this clearly. So, absolutely, when he sits down with Trump, he's going to bring all of this up. And I think that's another reason why he wants to meet with Trump. Because, of course, over the course of telephone calls, it's difficult maybe to convey this properly to Trump. Or at least that's what Putin probably thinks. And he's probably anyway also very frustrated that he's talking to Trump through Witkoff. And Witkoff has never been, he's an intermediary. I mean, it's not the same as speaking to the person himself about the fact that we spend too much time talking about territory. Though, territory is important. Putin is saying the 4 oblasts are Russian. He's not equivocating about this and never has done. You mentioned before, even if Putin wanted to make those concessions, it would be very difficult for him to get Russia as a whole to agree to that. You're absolutely right about this. But Putin has never shown the slightest desire to make those kind of concessions anyway. But anyway, put that aside. You're quite right. There are all of these other things: NATO membership, CIA presence in Ukraine, the nationalist forces in Ukraine, the Banderites and all of those people, demilitarization, denuclearization, elections, NATO, obviously, EU, the issue of the EU also. The Russians have been steadily shifting their position on EU membership as well, where they supported it in 2022. More and more Russian officials are now speaking out against it, including Medvedev and Lavrov, just to say. So all of these things Putin will want to discuss. The reason we spend so much time talking about territory is partly because that's what the West wants us to do. They've always made this out as a territorial land grab. Why Putin would want territory when Russia's the biggest country in the world, I really can't understand. But anyway, they make it out in that way. But also, of course, inevitably, because we spend so much time talking about the various details of the war, that it's very easy to think that, the war is being fought over Pokrovsk and who controls Pokrovsk, where, of course, Pokrovsk is itself only a means to an end, which is the achievement of the objectives, the goals, to use Putin's word, of the SMO.
Yeah, it's the goals of the SMO, exactly. Do you think that many things have already been pre-agreed?
No. I don't see how, actually. At what level could they have been pre-agreed? Some things might have been. There has been a lot of talk about
maybe contours of pre-agreement between Lavrov and Rubio then, maybe?
Well, maybe what there might be is a framework agreement about the sort of topics that need to be addressed and looked at. And that obviously, I think that probably is happening. But about the details of the settlement, I think we're as far away from that as ever. And the fact that we've had this enormous toing backwards and forwards between the Europeans, the Americans and themselves and all of that over the weekend shows that there is actually no real consensus, certainly not between the Americans and the Russians. If you believe the story that was spread last week that Putin said, I will cease fire if the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass. And now there are reasons to think he might not have said that, and that he might have also said, if the Ukrainians also withdraw from Zaporozhye and Kherson. Let's all get into that. But if you take that view, if you assume that those reports from last week are true, then already you can see that the Europeans, the Americans, and all of the rest are moving rapidly to rejecting that demand which Putin made last week.
Yeah, if you believe those reports.
If you believe it, exactly.
Right. All right, we will end the video there, theduran.locals.com. We are on Rumble and X and Telegram. And go to the Duran shop. Pick up some merch like what we are wearing in this video update. There's a link in the description box down below. Take care.